you had to write one sentence to summarize your life story, what would you write? Now, most of the time you think of an obituary, you think of a single column filled with significant achievements, maybe a few key dates, and maybe at the end a list of immediate relatives. But the truth is that almost every person's life can be summarized using just one sentence. I'm going to give you an example of one I saw this past week. On Monday of this past week, Robert Hansen, that former FBI agent, died after spending 22 years in prison in Florence, Colorado. And I've got a screenshot of the way NBC News announced his death. Here's what it says. Robert Hansen, FBI agent who spied for the Russians, dies in Supermax prison. Now, if you remember his story, you know it's a little more complicated than that. He was this famous FBI agent who became compromised, wound up spying for the Russians back in the early 1990s before being caught. Some of you have read the books and seen the movies and all of that. But at the really basic level, when you boil it all down, that sentence pretty much tells the story. If you look back at some other famous people who have already passed away this year, you'll see similar examples. So I've got another picture I want to show you. These are all people that have already passed away in 2023, and you'll recognize most of them. But I want you to listen to how their deaths were explained. The New York Times announced the death of Tina Turner with the headline, "Tina Turner, magnetic singer of explosive power, is dead at 83. You think about her life? It's pretty much it. Earlier in May, the Los Angeles Times ran the headline, "Denny Crum, a John Wooden disciple who coached Louisville to 2 NCAA titles, dies at 86. The end of April, the New York Times started the obituary of Jerry Springer, saying, "King of trashy daytime TV, used sex and fights to rival Oprah's ratings." On the opposite end of the spectrum, they started Tim Keller's by saying, "The Reverend Timothy Keller, famous author and pioneering Manhattan evangelist, dies at 72. On May 18th, just a few weeks ago, they published the obituary of the famous NFL player Jim Brown with the headline, "Jim Brown, football great and civil rights champion, dies at 87. And then just in January, last but not least, Lisa Marie Presley. Here's what it said. "Singer, songwriter, and daughter of Elvis, dies at 54. If anything were to happen to me, it might say, "Local pastor and father of 3 sons, dies of exhaustion." That would be the story. Now, it doesn't tell the whole story, right? You think about these people, famous people, accomplished a lot. It doesn't tell the whole story. But when you really boil it down, it's a pretty accurate description of how these people remembered. And all it took was just one sentence. Now, if you have your Bible or your phone, I want you to turn to Exodus chapter 3. Last weekend, we kicked off this series we're calling Shadow Work, and we're looking at the story of Moses, and we're talking about how long before Moses ever stepped into the spotlight, there were some things that had to happen in the shadows for God to transform him into the person he was created to be. And last weekend, we spent most of our time in Exodus 2, where you find Moses right in the middle of what we would call a midlife crisis. Only instead of lasting maybe a few weeks or a few months, it lasted for 40 years. We talked about this last week, and so I don't want to belabor this, but one of the things we know about Moses is that his life can be interpreted through 3 distinct 40-year periods. So the first 40 years of his life, he lived as a prince of Egypt. He was adopted into Pharaoh's family. He was set at the best table, lived in the best house, had the best of everything. One ancient historian says it was during that time that it's quite possible and even probable that they were preparing Moses to eventually be the Pharaoh himself. But then all of that comes to an abrupt end at the age of 40 when Moses lost his temper, killed an Egyptian construction foreman, and winds up fleeing to the desert of Midian, where he will then spend the next 40 years of his life. It's kind of that midlife crisis that comes right in the middle of his life, far removed from the spotlight that he had grown up in. And make sure you understand, if you weren't here last week, I hope you go back and listen. To Moses, that was not a temporary setback. It's not like, "Oh man, I'm going to get through this." No, that was his new reality. He was convinced that that was what his life was going to look like for the rest of his life. You go back to Exodus 2, verse 15, it says it like this: when Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. Your translation may say that he settled in Midian. So he's found this place that he never expected to be, that's far removed from the place that he wanted to be, and that's where he now lives. He is settled for a life that is less than the life he expected. And it all happened because of one incredibly stupid decision. And every time I think about that, I always ask myself, like, what was Moses doing during those 40 years? Now, we know he was watching sheep and he was hanging out with his family, but if you read the story, that entire 40-year period gets reduced down to just 12 verses. So what was Moses doing? And my guess is he was doing what a lot of us do. He's trying to make the best of a bad situation. At the same time, he's asking questions like, I wonder what it would have been like if I had done this instead of that. Or if I had gone here instead of there. Or if I'd have made a different decision, I wonder how my life would look. And so he spends 40 years, from the age of 40 until the age of 80, convinced that his best days are behind him, and he's messed his life up. But then you turn to Exodus 3, and the craziest, most unexpected, unpredictable thing that could ever happen happens. After maintaining a 40-year silence, God speaks to an 80-year-old shepherd who lives out in the middle of nowhere. So make sure you understand, if Moses had died like during that 40-year period, or if he had been discovered during that 40-year period, the one-sentence summary of his life would not have painted a pretty picture. It might have said something like, former member of royal family turned murderer found living in obscurity. It'd be one of those podcast series, we found the murderer. Potential successor to throne found shepherding in Midian. Young superstar turned elderly fugitive, a cautionary tale. If you think about it, here's this guy. He's 80 years old. He's had a long, complicated journey that has gone in the wrong direction. And you have to believe he's out there, spends his days out in the fields with the sheep, and all he can think about is how he's messed his life up in a permanent way. And some of you know what that feels like. There's something in your past, and every time you think about it, it almost takes your breath away. Some poor choice, some dumb decision, some wrong turn that you feel like has complicated your life in a way to you that feels permanent. One of the things we want to do as we work through this story is talk about some key ideas that you see demonstrated in Moses' story that will hopefully help you make sense of your story. So last week we talked about this idea that whenever you do it your way instead of God's way, it gets really complicated. And as soon as we said that last week, some of you were like, yep, because you've got some stories and maybe even some scars, and there's things that you're going through right now that are so complicated that most people wouldn't understand because you chose to do it your way rather than God's way. But then when you get to Exodus 3, there's another important truth that's critical to remember, and here it is. God loves to use messed up people to accomplish monumental tasks. God loves to use messed up people to accomplish monumental tasks. Now, in our culture, especially right now, a lot of people bought into this idea of the cancel culture, right? So if somebody does something you don't like, or they say something that you don't agree with, or even if they think about something differently than you do, there's this tendency within all of us to convince ourselves that that person deserves to be canceled. They deserve to be erased and sidelined, and both sides do it, and unfortunately, we even do it sometimes in the church. And you know how this works. Somebody says something that sounds weird, or maybe challenges what you think you believe, or maybe they fall off the wagon, or they go over the cliff, or they get caught in some sort of scandal, and rather than trying to restore that person, what happens? A lot of times, churches, and we're all famous for this, we have a tendency to pile on that person before shutting that person out or cutting them off. But the good news is that God doesn't do that. He is much more compassionate. He is much more loving than we are. And rather than writing people off, He loves to use messed up people to do monumental things. And believe it or not, the reason that's true is because messed up people are the only people He has to choose from. Because everybody at some level is messed up. So you read through the Bible and you read all the names of people that we think are the heroes of the faith. If you're not careful, you'll start to think that you're reading like the starting lineup for heaven's all-star team. When in reality, you go back and you read the stories of those people and you think, man, these people were messed up. And they were. Noah had a problem with alcohol. Jacob had a problem with honesty. Rahab was a prostitute. David oversaw a conspiracy to commit murder. Peter had a pretty violent temper. Elijah, you go back to the prophet Elijah, battled depression, considered suicide. And then you think about Paul, the guy that wrote most of the New Testament. And we know for certain that he oversaw the execution of at least one early Christian leader. So you think about all those people and more just like, and you think, man, in today's world, all of those people would be canceled. All of those people would be sidelined. But God doesn't do that. He uses messed up people to accomplish monumental things. But the question is, how does He do that? And what you find in Exodus 3 is God Himself speaking to this 80-year-old shepherd, and He gives him this opportunity to rewrite his future. Now, most of the time you hear that word rewrite, you think about rewriting something that's already been written. God does even more than that. Rather than giving the opportunity to rewrite his past, He's given him a chance to rewrite his future. So I want you to look at this with me. Exodus 3, verse 1. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Now make sure you catch that line where it says He's on the far side of the wilderness. Some translations say He was on the edge of the desert. But however you want to translate that, it's clear this is not a place that Moses ever expected to be. He's about as far removed from the spotlight as he could possibly be. But it's at that point when he is as far away as he can get that God decides to break His silence, and He speaks to Moses in verse 2. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight. Why does the bush does not burn up? When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses, and Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then He said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Now, there's four things you see in this passage, this process of God allowing Moses to rewrite his future. And here's the first step. You have to listen closely. So here's Moses. He's out there on the far side of the wilderness. He's out there on the edge of the desert, as far away from the spotlight that he had grown up in as you could possibly get, enduring another boring day in an endless string of 40 years worth of boring days, when all of a sudden he looks up and he sees something that he'd never seen before. The Bible calls it a burning bush. Now, if you look online, you'll find all kinds of people offering up all kinds of ridiculous explanations of how this really wasn't a bush and it really didn't burn. But don't pay any attention to that, because the main emphasis of the story is not on the bush. And a lot of people have explanations about that, but here's where I am. If we can come up with trick birthday candles that light back up after you blow them out, I'm pretty sure God can figure out how to have a bush that doesn't burn up. That's kind of where I'm at. But again, that's not the main emphasis of the story. The main emphasis of the story is what happens to Moses after Moses notices this bush, and just so you know, that's normally how it works. There's normally something that has to get your attention that causes you to listen to what God has to say. And most of the time, it's something that's out of the ordinary, something you couldn't have predicted, something that you may have never seen coming. For some people, it's a pink slip or a call from the doctor. Sometimes it's the unexpected end of a relationship, a car accident, the death of somebody you love, a financial setback that you're unprepared for, an arrest, a lawsuit, a demotion. I mean, it can be anything, but whatever it is, it's almost always something that you didn't see coming that causes you to listen a little bit closer. The great C.S. Lewis said it like this: pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our consciences, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And I don't know why it is, but you've experienced this most of the time. You have to get hit with something before you're ready to listen. So here's Moses out there on the edge of the desert, most likely relitigating all the pain of his past, when out of nowhere, this burning bush grabs his attention, and he hears God speak his name and reintroduce himself. And then you get to verse 7. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. That's pretty good. You should. That's pretty good. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So after 40 long years of waiting, hasn't heard a word from God. He's been standing out there just rehashing, relitigating all the past, and all of a sudden God speaks, and Moses is ready to listen, and God tells him that he's going to rescue the Israelites. And not only is he going to rescue them, he's going to help them escape Egypt altogether. He's going to take them to this land that he describes as flowing with milk and honey. We call it the Promised Land. And keep in mind that even as God is saying all this on paper, this is a mismatch. I mean, this is something that cannot happen. The Egyptians have the strongest army. They're the most advanced culture, and the Israelites are slaves. I mean, it seems like an impossible scenario, and yet even as he speaks, Moses finds himself hanging on every word because God is about to do something that he could have never predicted. But then you get to verse 10. And when you get to verse 10, God drops a bomb on Moses that redirected his life in a way that he could have never imagined. Here's what God says. So now, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. So here's Moses. He's listening to what God says. I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. And then you get to verse 10, and he says, and here's what you're going to do. And Moses is like, what? Moses is 80 years old, out in the middle of nowhere, and so he thinks he's misheard what God said. So you look at verse 11. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Now here's the second step in this process. First, you listen closely. Then at some point, you have to reclaim your calling. So here's Moses. Put yourself in his shoes. Spent the last 40 years of his life out in the middle of nowhere, watching sheep and hanging out with his family. And to make it even more complicated, you have to remember, he's still wanted for murder back in Egypt. So from one angle, it would be hard to find anybody that would be a more unlikely candidate than Moses. But from a different perspective, he's the perfect candidate. Acts chapter 7, Stephen describes Moses saying, Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. So here's a guy who at one point in his life had sat at the king's table. He'd driven the king's barges up and down the Nile River. He may have even led a division of the king's army. So if you're looking for a guy who understands how the Egyptians think and how they operate, then it's hard to find anybody that would understand that at a deeper level than Moses. The only thing left was for Moses to say yes. So there comes a point in every story in Scripture, in every story that you've ever heard about people that God uses in significant ways, that there comes a point when you either have to say yes or no. And that's it. If you keep reading in Exodus, you'll find that rather than saying an immediate yes, Moses does what a lot of us do. He likes to come up with this whole list of excuses. So he says, I've messed up too much. I don't know enough. I'm not a good speaker. The people won't listen. And we read that and we think, well, that's ridiculous. But then we turn around and we do the exact same thing. It's like we feel God is calling us to do something. And instead of saying an immediate yes, here's what we say. I'd love to do that, but I'm too busy. Most likely busy with stuff that doesn't matter. Or I'm too old, too young, don't know enough, don't know how to do it, never done it before. There's other people that be better than I. Got some problems. We go on and on and on and on. And that's exactly what Moses did. That's where he was. He didn't think he could do what God was calling him to do. So you get to verse 12, and it's upon hearing his hesitancy that God gives Moses a promise. So I want you to look at this with me, verse 12. And God said, I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Now, I should have mentioned this earlier, but the location where all this took place, earlier in the passage, it calls it Mount Horeb. Later, when you get to Exodus 19, it'll become Mount Sinai. It's the same place, just two different names. And that's the place where God will meet with Moses and give him the Ten Commandments. So even though Moses feels like he's a long way from home here, as it turns out, he's exactly where God wanted him to be. But there's something else here in this promise that I don't want you to miss. God promises Moses, here's how you're going to know. One day in the future, you and the people of Israel will worship God on this same mountain. The catch, though, and the thing I don't want you to miss, is that Moses will not experience the fulfillment of this promise until after he says yes to God's call. Now, most time we want the fulfillment before we say yes, but God says that's the way it works. The only way you're going to know is if you say yes and you try to do what I'm asking you to do. So here's the third step in this process. You listen closely, you reclaim your calling, and then eventually you have to take the risk. This past week, I got an email from John and Money Matthews. They were here a few years ago. They are the leaders of the Southwest India Christian Mission. They're one of about, 10 or 11 organizations that we support pretty heavily throughout the year. So every weekend when you give your offering, a healthy percentage of that goes to support missionaries all over the world who are doing some cool things in some really hard places. And we've supported them for more than 30 years. I looked it up. And in the email, John talks about some of the challenges they're facing. And they're in a place where the persecution is just so intense. We get mad if somebody puts something on Facebook that we don't like, But these folks are in a really hard environment. It's 80% Hindu where they live, less than 2% Christian. And in the midst of all that, they're running feeding programs. They've got orphanages. They've got schools. They're planting churches. But it is not an easy assignment. One of the things that struck me, though, in this email is that near the end of it, John tells part of their story. He doesn't go into a lot of detail, but some of you know them, so you know the story. Back in the early 1970s, he and his wife both came to Cincinnati to attend college, and over those 4 years, they both did really well, and they were given a green card. They were given permanent resident status, which would allow them to remain in the United States for the rest of their lives. During that time, they both got jobs. John was a public school teacher in Cincinnati. Money worked as a registered nurse at a Cincinnati hospital. During that time, they attended a church that I'm very familiar with, the Bridgetown Church of Christ, which is just off the campus of Cincinnati Christian University. And while they're attending there, they've been there a few years. The elders started to talk to them, and the elders started to encourage them. They said, hey, if you'd be willing to go back to India and start a mission to reach people, we would support you financially. Now, I want you to listen to this part of the email to John. Here's what he said. The tough decision. It was not easy to give up all the comforts and go back to the poor conditions. No running water, no electricity, no roads, no car, so on. He went on. Many of our relatives and friends called us fools because millions of Indians are waiting to come to America, while at the same time we gave up our green cards and went back to India. Now you hear that and you think, why would anybody do that? I mean, why would anybody give up life in America along with a steady paycheck, a secure retirement, and health insurance and all that stuff that we tend to obsess over to go back to a place where the people around you don't want you there, and you may never live in a house that has running water or electricity? Why would you do that? Because God told you to. So here's the deal. When God calls you to do something, it's true that there may be some element of risk in saying yes. That's always been true. But the greater risk is when you say no. And the reason that's true is because of what God says next to Moses in verse 13. Moses once again reveals his hesitancy to say yes by asking another question. But I want you to look at how God responds. So verse 13, Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. Now, verse 14 is one of those verses. We could talk about that every week for the next 6 months. We wouldn't even come close to exhausting what all this means. But just for now, understand, this is the place where God tells Moses his personal name. If you were to see it in Hebrew, there's no vowels in Hebrew. It would be the letters YHWH, and we pronounce it as Yahweh. And there's a lot of different ways to translate this, but usually you see some variation of what it says here. I am who I am. Or sometimes it says I will be what I will be or who I will be. One Hebrew scholar translated it, I am who I am, and I am there with you wherever you are. There is no escaping me. Wherever you go, there I am. You think, what is he trying to say? It connects back to verse 12 where God says to Moses, hey, I know this is a big ask. I know this is risky, but I'll be with you. I think God is reminding Moses, no matter where he goes, not only will he be with him, but he's inviting Moses to have a personal relationship with him. See, it's hard to have a relationship with somebody that you don't even know their name, right? So he says to Moses, hey, I know your name. In fact, I know more about you than you know about you, but now I'm inviting you to get to know me. And that's the fourth step in this process. You have to learn to continually seek God's presence. And what you're going to see throughout the rest of Moses' story is that the deeper he goes in his relationship with God, the more he discovers about himself. For Moses, it was the continued presence of God and his increasing knowledge of God that changed literally everything. Literally, overnight, Moses goes from being a forgotten shepherd, living in an out-of-the-way place, whose best days were obviously behind me. Everybody knew that, to confronting the most powerful man on the planet and leading a nation of God's people toward the promise. So make sure you understand, the one-sentence summary of Moses' life was completely rewritten because of one encounter with God. Earlier this week, I read an article that highlighted the work of a man named Bill McDonald. Since 2006, he's been the editor of the obituary section of the New York Times. He grew up, his dream was to be a Pulitzer Prize winning investigative journalist who exposed government corruption. Instead, he became a Pulitzer Prize winning obituary editor, which is kind of the same, but also a lot different. The reason the article caught my attention was because of the headline. I took a screenshot of it. It says, "Obituaries for the Pre-Dead." The first line of the article says this: "If you can read this, then you are almost certainly pre-dead," which I thought was a great way to put that. And it goes on and talks about how they have a staff, there's 4 or 5 of them, of professional obituary writers who will begin, and whenever they have a famous person, they begin working on that person's obituary years in advance. They don't wait. That's why whenever somebody famous dies, their obituary shows up within 4 or 5 minutes, because they've been working on this years in advance. For example, right now at the New York Times, they have on file over 1,700 obituaries of people who are still alive. And sometimes the writers will even call the person that they're writing the obituary about and interview them. And usually they say it like this. They say, usually we just tell them that we're updating their biographical file for possible future use, which I guess is a pretty good way of putting that. You think about that, there's a lot of problems that can come up. And one of the challenges that arises when you write somebody's obituary in advance is there have been several documented instances in which the subject of the obituary outlived the person who wrote the obituary, which is kind of creepy, when you think about it. The other challenge, though, this happens all the time according to this article, is that when you write an obituary in advance, what tends to happen is that the story of that person's life can change pretty dramatically from the end of the time you wrote it to the time they actually pass away. Sometimes there's this period of years, and so the story gets all complicated. Sometimes it gets better, sometimes it gets worse. But the point is that the story can change until the story's over. That's just how it works. So some of you right now, you find yourself in a situation in which if somebody were to write an advanced copy of your obituary, it might not look too good. Like the one-sentence summary might not be very compelling. It might say something like this. It might say, "Once promising life derailed by selfishness ends prematurely." Or maybe, "Person once known as passionate follower of Jesus who later drifted, found unresponsive." I preached a lot of funerals like that. Or maybe for you it would say, "Undecided man dies unexpectedly. Eternal destination unknown." That works. Honestly, for some of us, a one-sentence summary right now would not tell a very good story. But here's the good news. Until the story is over, the story can change. Just like Moses, one encounter with God can transform your story, can rewrite your story in a way that you could never predict, you could never explain, but that can be experienced. So I want you to stand with me. And as we close our time together, we're going to sing a couple final songs. And if you feel the Holy Spirit calling you to make some sort of decision, to put your trust in Christ, or if you want to pray with somebody, or if you just have questions about what your next step should be, we'd love to help you. David will be here. I'll be here. You just come talk to one of us on this front row at any point during these next 2 songs. Or maybe you're here and you're ready to put your membership to become an official part of the church family here. And same deal. If you just want to talk to us, if you want to do something, we'll be glad to help you. Just meet us up here.